Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. My guest today is Maya Leibman. Maya has spent nearly 28 years with American Airlines, the last 10 and a half of which she's held the role of Chief Information Officer. She's led the airline through trying times from 9/11 through the financial crisis of 2008, but no crisis was as extreme as the pandemic of the past couple of years. I look forward to understanding how she has led through these difficult times and how the modernization of IT prior to the pandemic has served it well through the pandemic. Maya Leibman, welcome to Technovation. It's great to speak with you today.
Thanks, Peter. I'm super excited to be here.
No, it's a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this conversation, certainly. Well, Maya,
I've been looking forward to it as well. And I have to say, Peter, I don't know, how long have you been doing this podcast?
Since November of 2010.
I think that's around, we met not long after that. And I remember you saying, hey, listen, I do this podcast, would you like to do this with me sometime? And I remember thinking, like, what's a podcast?
Yeah.
I have to say, in this day and age when everybody has a podcast and there is a podcast literally for everything, you were doing podcasts before they were cool.
Oh, that's really nice of you to say, Maya. Thanks for mentioning that. Thanks for noticing. That's really nice. And I've been looking forward ever since then to having you as the interviewee. So I'm glad we're finally making it happen.
Awesome.
Excellent. Well, Maya, you are the Chief Information Officer of American Airlines, a role you've had for nearly 10 and a half years of your most of 3 decades with the company now. So a bit more than a third of your time now spent as Chief Information Officer. And I wonder, within the context of a major airline of great consequence, talk a bit about your purview as CIO. What's under your set of responsibilities, if you will?
Yeah. Although now that you mention it, like 3 decades, that's a really long time. I totally remember when when American Airlines was recruiting at the business school I was at, and I was thinking, oh, that sounds really interesting. I'll go there. I'll do that for like a year, maybe 2 years at the most. And then, like 30 years later, I'm almost still here. In my purview, I have, a lot of what you would think of when you think of traditional IT. So map dev and maintenance and infrastructure and network. I also have some of the fun new stuff like data and cyber and digital. And as well, really setting the foundation for our modernization journey. So our move to cloud and our adoption of advanced analytics and ML and AI, and really focusing on different ways of working, which dovetails with this idea of enterprise planning and prioritization. All that sort of rolls up to my area.
Interesting overview there. I really appreciate that. And I wanted to, I would definitely want to get into the context of some of those modernization activities and as well as the enterprise planning and so forth. I thought maybe we begin though here at the outset with the remarkable challenges that you and the airline have undertaken as the industry has through the course of the pandemic. There were few industries, if any, that were as adversely impacted during this period where for such a prolonged period, few of us were traveling for personal or business reasons. And I wonder, what are your reflections now a couple years hence from this experience, this trial that you and the company have been through, finding ways to make it to the other side. Thankfully, having taken a number of American Airlines flights in recent weeks, I know that a lot of them are now packed again, which is great to see, certainly. Talk a bit about that experience and learnings from it, if you will.
Yeah, it's it's been a crazy couple of years, as it has been for everyone. But literally, we went, in the course of just a few days, in March of 2020, we lost like 90% of our revenue. I mean, just like that. And we set down hundreds and hundreds of aircraft. We literally weren't selling our product for a really long time. It was insane. And I can assure you that there is no system at this airline. There's no piece of technology. There's no process for having hundreds of airplanes on the ground, because that's not what they were intended to do. And so we were really forced with having to make a lot of decisions really quickly about what it meant to operate, or in large part not operate, in this environment. Demand started to come back, and we really had to think about, well, where should we be flying? What should our fleet look like? who is flying us at this point in time? Like, what is it that makes people have to fly when the vast majority of people were sheltering in their homes? And so intellectually, it was a really fascinating time period. Emotionally, it was a real roller coaster as we had to contend with, our workforce and issues and keeping people safe and yet keeping the airline running. So just an incredibly fascinating time.
And I wonder, Maya, were there, they say necessity is the mother of invention. Were there inventions because of the necessities that in your mind wouldn't have been undertaken, but for the crisis that will have kind of longer tails after we can get to a point where we're a little bit on a surer footing that it's in the past? Are there, ideas you pursued because you had to that actually proved to be, new sources of innovation, perhaps that come to mind?
Yeah, one of the things that happened was our entire priority list kind of went out the window. We had been working on some mobile technology for our gate agents to bring them out in front of our customers, out from behind the gate. But instead, like in one day, we went from that to, manufacturing our own plexiglass dividers to further separate our agents from our customers. So just a complete reversal in many cases. One of our biggest priorities, became the development of a touchless kiosk. So how could you interact with the kiosk without, to check in without actually touching it, and who would have ever thought that would have been a thing? So we definitely, necessity really prompted some new pieces of technology, some new functions, some new cool ways to develop, to work with our iPhones and the applet functionality to be able to render a piece of the kiosk on your phone. So there were some cool things that came out of it, but I think one of the real lessons, and I think most companies, most people sort of learned this, was not just what we did, but how we worked. And I think at American, we really started valuing different things. There was a lot of focus and value placed on action and doing over, let's say, analysis and meetings. There was a lot of focus placed on, getting something done versus, getting something perfect. A lot of focus placed on empowering our teams versus like putting our personal leadership stamp on every effort. So it really came down to not just what we did, but because of the pandemic, but what the pandemic taught us about how to work.
That's fascinating. I appreciate that overview, Maya. You alluded to, as you were describing your purview, what you've come to name the next generation strategic initiatives that you were in the process even before the pandemic of introducing. You referenced the transition to the cloud, advanced analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, the introduction of DevOps methods and tools as well. I wonder, to what extent did those prove to be advantages? The fact that you had introduced a lot of those methods, even if not all of them had been fully implemented at that point. To what extent were those sources of resilience as well, that you were operating in a more modern way once the crisis hit?
Yeah, it was really helpful that we had done a lot of the heavy lifting before the crisis. For example, there was a time several years ago when we were super proud of ourselves because we could release on AA.com like twice a month. We're like, man, look at what we've done. But over the, several years, we really focused on modernizing that platform through tool chain, through automation, through ways of working, to the place where we got, the ability to release on demand. We got rid of the release calendar entirely. And now we, write a little piece of code and we just set it free and it goes off into production. And it's beautiful. If we hadn't had that prior to the crisis, when literally it was like, okay, the government has said by tomorrow, we have to prevent anyone, who's flying via China from entering the US, there's no way we would have been able to adhere to that new regulation if we didn't have the foundation in place. For example, that one example on A.com where we could release whenever.
And I know it's you've also been focused a lot on leveraging technology to power new products and services. I know from past conversations we've talked about improved customer handling through disruptions, new loyalty program offerings. I wonder if I would love to have maybe you delve into those two among perhaps others as well that you've been focused on in terms of the application of technology to improve customer outcomes and customer experiences.
Yeah, the worst experience for the customer at the airline is during an irregular operation, like a bad weather event, where flights are canceled, and as a result, there's not a lot of opportunity to protect our customers on other flights. In addition, it's a terrible experience for our team members. Our pilots and our flight attendants get knocked off of their sequence, and how to get them back onto a sequence and repaired with the crew that they should be with is a really monstrous challenge. Modern technology these days provides so many opportunities to do this better than we've ever been able to do it before. And so we're getting to a place where by using some of these new tools like machine learning, we're much better able to repair those sequences for our crew members, find protect options for our customers, create new opportunities to recover from irregular operations, improve how much time an aircraft spends at a gate in order to maximize the connection opportunities, but minimize the time it spends on the ground. You mentioned loyalty, so many opportunities to provide benefits to our customers that they value rather than the ones that we think that they might value. Opportunities for us to be more predictive about whether a customer is likely to want to repurchase. They haven't quite made it to the status tier that they had last year. Would they be willing to spend money in order to achieve that? So much ability with these predictive tools. Is a part of an aircraft going to require maintenance in the near future? How likely are we to mishandle a bag if a customer checks in at a terminal different from the terminal that their flight is leaving from, so they have less time to get that bag to the flight? How can we recommend destinations to customers? Right now, there's this really interesting trend. Before, the difference between business and leisure was really pronounced. We could tell the difference between that type of traffic. But now with sort of remote work and this combination, this idea of bleisure, where you may travel to your headquarters for a conference because they're getting everybody together. But then you may add on a couple extra days because you're in Florida and your family has come with you. Getting more predictive and understanding how people are traveling, their travel patterns today. All of that is enabled because of the modern technology that we have access to these days.
Yeah, that's really some fascinating insights there. And one of the fascinating aspects of your rise within the organization, your role immediately prior to your current one as Chief Information Officer, Maya, was as president of the American AAdvantage loyalty program. And 10 and a half years ago when you became CIO, certainly the average CIO, you might even argue the average CIO today even doesn't necessarily have as much of a real customer touch point as they should. Thankfully, that there are tremendous advances that have been made there. But you came to this role having spent a lot of time thinking about working with the customer and sort of having that person at the center of your thought process. I wonder, how did that color your experience in the early stages, to say nothing of the progression of your time as Chief Information Officer, in thinking about the degree to which technology could influence the customer's experience?
Yeah, that job as president of AAdvantage, that was one of the funnest jobs I've had, because people are just crazy about this loyalty program, and they do all sorts of crazy things, to try to maximize their utilization of the mile and the currency that we've developed. And these crazy mileage runs at the end of the year to try to gain status. So I really enjoyed that job. It was a lot of fun. And it gave me a really good window into what customers value and what they're willing to do and how they want to interact with the company and the engagement that they want to have with the company. And I think that was one of the reasons why I got this role, because at the time it was like, look, we're not looking for a CIO who's a super hardcore technologist. We want someone who really understands what technology can do for our customers and for the business. And so, that's sort of been, I feel like, my contribution in this role is really, we boil our strategy down into just sort of 3 words: deliver value faster. Because, what we'll hear is, look, I like what I get from the technology organization. I just want more of it and I want it faster. And that's what we want to provide as well, because we know that everything that we do, every piece of value that we put out there is something that ultimately will benefit the customer. And that needs to be our rallying cry and our mission.
And we've talked about a number of the levers associated with delivering value faster. Anything we haven't covered that you would reflect on as some of the important components that enable that for the organization?
Well, we talk a lot about, inputs, outputs, and outcomes. So, the inputs are like, are we getting better? Are we improving in our agile maturity? And are we adopting DevOps principles and ways of working? Are we moving to the cloud? What are the things that we're doing? The outputs are, are we improving our development cycle time? Are we increasing our deployment frequency? Are we reducing our minutes of impact? Are we reducing our digital risk scores? Those are the things that we're measuring to determine, are the inputs working? Because if we do these inputs, we will get these outputs. But the outputs aren't enough. What we really need are the outcomes, which is, are we making money? Are we improving our likelihood to recommend? Are we reducing our costs? And so we have developed an approach where we are taking all of our objectives and assigning key results to those that help us understand, what are the outcomes? Like, are we really moving the dial on these metrics that ultimately benefit our customer?
A great framing, certainly. I also wanted to ask you, you've had an unusually long tenure as a chief information officer, and you've had a long time horizon, thought process. It's not a role that you've, for some people who tend to stay, 2-3 years, they may introduce a few things of a strategic nature, but they don't necessarily live through the consequences, the improvements that have been made, the course corrections that are necessary beyond that. I wonder if you could take a moment in reflecting, as somebody who's now, more than double the average tenure in role as a CIO, on the advantages of having that longer time horizon to think about the implications and ramifications of all that you and your team are introducing.
I guess no one's quite figured out that I don't know what I'm doing yet. I found this deck. I was cleaning out like some old files a while ago when I was moving offices, and I found this deck that talked about sort of this great new technology discovery called client server technology. And so, there's been a lot of advancements over the last couple decades. And I think what they've allowed is, look, all these ideas, all those things that I rattled off, like, understanding, where customers want to fly and how likely they are to, to sell up into a different cabin, or, whether we're likely to mishandle back. These are not new ideas. I mean, we've had these ideas since the beginning of time, and every airline has, and every customer who's flown on an airline has said, why does the airline not remember that I like this drink, or that sort of thing? They're not new ideas. What the technology these days has allowed us to do is actually start to realize them. We have always had an insane amount of data. What we haven't had is a really good, efficient way to turn that data into actionable information. And that's one of the more exciting things that I've seen over this time period, is that we can stop talking about it and start actually doing it.
That's really interesting. You also mentioned that when you took on this role, the mandate was not to, and the thought process was not to bring in somebody who is simply just a deeply technical person. Let me put a fine point on that. You were an English literature major, rather, as an undergrad. You have an MBA. Talk about your own education from a technology perspective, clearly on the job and as an autodidact by nature. But you are running a very complex organization that's not for the faint of heart, where most of your peers, were once programmers or were computer scientists or engineers as undergrads, and perhaps have, an earlier introduction, at least, to technology. That said, you've been, by all accounts, very successful in role. So talk a bit about your own means of educating yourself from a technology perspective to be able to, operate as well as peers who are more deeply technical might.
Fortunately, I've surrounded myself with really strong technical talent. And what I've told them, and what I think they like, is that I'm not super technical. So I'm not, like, I've been really clear, I'm not going to determine our cloud strategy. You're going to determine our cloud strategy. But I am going to sit back and say, why is it that we haven't prevented releases from going to production that have a vulnerability? It's not, I get to sit sort of on the periphery and say, ask the more pointed questions about why we're doing some of the things that we're doing, whereas some of the more technical people might say, look, we're going to Azure, we're going to AWS, and this is how we're going to use containers, and that's great for them to do it. What I feel like my value is ensuring that I understand that we're running a really safe and efficient operation that allows us to deliver value faster for our customers.
That's a great answer. I also wanted to ask you, having spent a lot of time with you and peers of yours across this industry, it's a very complex industry, to say the least. There are so many exogenous factors that determine the relative success of an airline or not. It's very much tied to business cycles. There are periods of great expansion and periods where there's a necessity for some consolidation. There are very powerful unions. There's all kinds of complexities. And one of the things I've always found, a good friend of mine who was at a different airline, was with the airline for maybe 20 years, the last 5 or so as chief information officer. He went on to become the CIO of multiple other companies and in other industries. And he always used to say to me, he would list off some of the things I just did in mentioning kind of the complexities and what makes it difficult. And then he would say, and I loved every minute of it. I miss it, in fact. and I wonder, as somebody who, had planned coming out as an MBA to maybe spend a couple of years in this industry and then go off and do something else, what is it that kind of, plants those roots so deeply for somebody like yourself that you find all these challenges to be so engrossing?
Yeah. When I think back just over the last couple of decades, at a big macro level, we went from 9/11 to the financial crisis, to a bankruptcy, to a merger, to, a pandemic. It was, on a huge scale, really seismic business changes. But then within each of those, more macro events, there are hundreds of micro events. I remember we hired a new guy to run comms here, and he came in the morning, and we were making a decision about essentially $1 billion investment in some airport renovations. And later that day, a big issue happened with our unions. And he came back in, and he wasn't from the airline industry, but his comment was, wow, it's a pretty fascinating industry where $1 billion investment is not the biggest news of the day. And, and it's true. I totally can understand where your friend is coming from. It's a fascinating industry. It is super complex. It makes you really stretch your thinking and your intellectual prowess, and it's fascinating and fun and exciting and crazy and scary, and there's fabulous people here too. So all that together, it makes it wonderful.
That's really great. I wanted to also ask you about, as somebody who's risen to your role as a female, a woman in technology, a field that is still underrepresented by your gender. If you have any reflections, actually, it's kind of interesting, Southwest has a female CIO. United does. Alaska until recently did, and Sharu is still in kind of the chain from a technology perspective as well. I'm sure that's not an exhaustive list. Yep. It's an industry that at least in recent years has made some progress. It would seem among you, for yourself and your peer group, even as more progress is necessary. I wonder, if you have any reflections about progress made or progress to come as it pertains to females in technology.
Yeah, it's really advanced. We're not where we need to be, but I remember going to conferences, tech conferences 10 years ago, and one of the best parts was like, you never, as a woman, had to wait in line for the bathroom. Like the men had to wait in line, which is something that you don't see very frequently. But now, I think you're familiar with the Slack group that Suja and a number of other women CIOs created, who are 200. All fabulous. And now this, we have a Slack group of 200 plus women in CIO equivalent roles in technology. And so it's definitely changing, and there's tons of opportunity, and there's tons of support through things like this Slack group and mentorship. And so I think it will only continue to improve. At American, I've been fortunate. I've worked for fabulous women. I've worked for fabulous men, like men who have been great allies, who've nurtured me, who've supported me, who've championed me, who've been really terrific. So, I think all of that together will continue to improve sort of the number and the scope of women in technology.
That's a really good, hopeful message there. I wanted to ask you also, as you look to the future, Maya, we've talked about a number of rising trends that you're riding and investing in. Are there others that come to mind that particularly excite you as you look a couple of years out that you think will be particularly impactful?
I could name, the stuff that you hear at any technology conference, like machine learning and AI and blockchain and quantum computing and computer vision. All of these things we're at different levels of exploration with, and all of them, I think, have different exciting trajectories. For me, at the end of the day, I care a lot more about how we work, because any really terrific piece of new technology or any great new idea or something that's put into production is something that someone else can copy. And yet, if you get really good at the how, that can be a strategic competitive advantage. And so some of that comes down to the processes, like, are we good at DevOps? Are we good at, Agile? Are we, good at automation and cloud and APIs and, all of the things that make up a, strong technology core. But really what I care about is how we treat people. And, are we empowering our teams? Are we helping others win? Are we, thinking big, but starting small? Are we communicating in a transparent way? Are we authentic? Are we empathetic? Are we connecting people? Are we creating an equitable work environment? All of those, I think, are the trends that I think are just most exciting and will never go out of style.
Yeah, great points all. I was going to ask you here at the close, Maya, as you reflect upon your journey to date, at least in your career, are there any secrets to your success? Are there, if there was a younger version of yourself or somebody who was relatively earlier in their career and they were asking for advice as to how they might have a career trajectory akin to your own, are there any lessons you would impart on that younger person to help them along the way?
I think leadership is a privilege. It's a gift. It's something that I take very seriously. And I think one of the best pieces of advice that I was given was, be the leader that you wish you had. And I don't always achieve that, but I aspire to that. And I think one of the things that I've realized, especially in the last couple of years during this pandemic, is, look, you just have to be an authentic leader, and if you can't be yourself, if you can't be real during a pandemic, then then it's going to be hard to be real any other time. But that's the kind of leader that people want. And so I guess I think what I would have told my younger self is, don't try so hard to be something that you're not, because that's just exhausting. And you can only do that for a certain period of time. Just be who you are.
Great advice, certainly. Well, Maya Leibman, I'm so pleased to know you as somebody that I've greatly admired, for somebody of great accomplishment, who's built great teams, who has many admirers, not only as colleagues, but as peers in the broader ecosystem. It's a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for taking time with me today and sharing some of the lessons from your career.
Thank you, Peter. I enjoy doing this, and someday I want to interview you and ask you all these same questions. Like you ask this trend question every time. I want to hear your thoughts on what you think the next big trends are and things like that.
We'll make that appointment soon then.
Okay, I look forward to it.
Thanks again.
All right, thank you.